Today we will be talking about the Naomi, the 167-foot yacht owned by Jordan Belfort, the former millionaire made famous for his financial frauds and more notably his memoirs and the movie The Wolf of Wall Street. Before we get into it, despite the name of the yacht being the Naomi in the movie, as named after Jordan's second wife, Naomi, the Duchess of Bay Bridge, the actual name of the yacht is the Nadine, which is her actual name. Nadine, not the Naomi. Before it was the Nadine, the ship sailed under a few other names as it had other owners before Jordan and before ending up at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. Despite people's strange affection for the rich suffering out on the water, R.I.P. Ocean Gate, the yacht actually has an interesting history filled with fashion icons, murder, and other influential people, which is worth talking about before we get into its demise in 1996. The yacht was born under the name Matilda. It was built in 1961 in Holland and at the time was 130 feet long. The yacht was like none other in the 1960s, with 5 staterooms, beautiful dining facilities, and many other amenities only suitable for the super rich. The name Matilda was short-lived as the original buyer backed out, and after a year or so, the Chanel family bought it and renamed it the Coco Chanel. Coco Chanel is known more famously for being the founder of the Chanel brand, but always had an attraction to yachting. She was actually once quoted saying, "As soon as you set foot on a yacht, you belong to some man, not to yourself, and you die of boredom." So naturally, her solution was to buy her own yacht. The yacht sailed under the Coco Chanel name for 14 years until it was sold again in 1977. Melvin Powers, a Texas millionaire and real estate developer, bought the yacht and renamed it the Jan Pamela. Melvin Powers has his own unique story, one that deserves its own movie, or at the very least, a Netflix documentary. A Texas millionaire on its own is pretty boring, but a Texas millionaire who was acquitted of murdering his aunt's husband is interesting enough. What makes it even more interesting is that Melvin Powers had an incestuous relationship with his aunt back in 1962, well before he ever bought the yacht. Roll Tide. Before we get to all that, a little backstory on Melvin is needed. Melvin was a Navy man. He worked many jobs, and then ended up being convicted and sent to jail for pulling a con job in Pontiac, Michigan, which just so happens to be in my home state and not very far from where I grew up. He served his 90 days in jail, and then while on probation decided to move to Houston. While there, his mother convinced him to reach out to her sister, Candy Mosler, who lived in the area with her husband, Jack. Candy and Jack Mosler were very well off as Jack had owned a number of financial companies. Jack Mosler found out about this weird affair that his wife was having with her nephew through his servants and after reading about it in his wife's diary. He avoided divorce due to not wanting any negative publicity as well as remembering the prenuptial agreement that he had signed, which means old dirty Aunt Candy would get half of everything he had. Candy and Jack did eventually separate, and after they did, Candy gave Melvin money to buy a mobile home business. During the murder trial, many employees of Jack Mosler said that Melvin Powers made several threats that he would kill Jack. Then, in 1964, when Aunt Candy returned home, she found her husband's body wrapped in a blanket. Jack Mosler had been bludgeoned and then stabbed 39 times. Both Candy and Melvin were on trial for the murder, and the trial took place 2 years after Jack was found dead. The New York Times described it as one of the most spectacular homicide trials ever. The jury eventually accepted the defense's case, voted for acquittal, and Melvin and Aunt Candy walked free. No one else was ever charged for the murder of Jack Mosler. A fitting end to this story was after the trial was over and both Jack and Candy were acquitted, they were seen kissing and then driving off into the sunset in a gold Cadillac. Their incestual relationship continued for a few years before they eventually separated. Aunt Candy later married a guy 19 younger than she was, but a year after they married, the poor guy mysteriously fell from a balcony of their mansion. He did live, but suffered brain damage, and Candy divorced him shortly after. Aunt Candy eventually died of an overdose on her own medication in 1976. Melvin did attend his aunt's funeral, and in typical rich guy fashion who's attending the funeral of an ex-lover, he did show up with a younger, attractive blonde woman. But getting back to the yacht, a year after Aunt Candy's death, he purchased it and renamed it the Jan Pamela. Under his ownership, the now Jan Pamela was sent off to Miami to get some upgrades. Originally, they started by adding a 10-foot-long fishing cockpit, and then later on added another 27 feet to the yacht. They literally cut the ship in two pieces, welded in this section, and then increased its total length to its final dimension of 167 feet. This new addition made room for a helipad, 2 more staterooms, bringing the total up to 7, a salon, and even a jacuzzi with mirrored ceilings. In 1983, Melvin did go bankrupt. The ship was sold and had a new name, the Edgewater. And for those curious, Melvin Powers died at the age of 68 in 2010. The name Edgewater didn't last long, as in 1989 it was sold and bought by 2 people, Mark Elliott and his employer, Bernie Little. Both Mark and Bernie had a lifelong love for this yacht back when it was owned by the Chanel family, and Bernie actually loved it so much that when he got the chance to buy it, he bought it sight unseen. Bernie made his fortunes by owning a distribution business for Anheuser-Busch. Just like the rest, though, they chose to rename it. Now called the Big Eagle, and under new ownership, the yacht yet again went under the knife for some much-needed upgrades. They pulled out all the windows, re-chromed them, repainted the entire yacht, and even pulled the engines and replaced them with 2 much larger cat engines, which doubled the horsepower to 800. The yacht even had a massive glass panel hidden under a pair of sofas. When a button was pushed, the sofas were lifted up by hydraulics, revealing the glass, which gave you a view of the sea under the yacht. The Big Eagle was now a popular charter yacht. Some of the clients included Burt Reynolds and Oprah Winfrey. But guess who her favorite client was? Jordan Belfort fell in love with the yacht during all of his charters, so much in fact that he begged Bernie to sell it to him. Jordan still needed to secure financing, but Bernie agreed to hold a note on the yacht for Jordan in 1995, so long as Mark Elliott would stay on as skipper. Jordan eventually took ownership in 1996, changed the yacht's name to its final name of the Nadine, remember, not Naomi, Nadine, kept Mark on as a skipper, and continued to use the yacht personally as well as chartered it out. He also chose to upgrade the Nadine with some interior restyling, loads of mirrors, extending the upper deck, and even adding a crane that was capable of picking up and lowering a seaplane. It also held a lot more than just a seaplane, including a 30-foot tender, 2 18-foot dinghies, 4 motorcycles, 6 jet skis, and a ton of professional diving gear. Mark Elliott later confirmed the crazy parties Jordan would have on board, but to him, Mark's job was only to protect the Nadine. He was even quoted saying that Jordan was a brilliant and lovely person, but when he was in party mode, he was out of control. The fun was short-lived. Jordan and crew were making an 85-mile trip between Italy and Sardinia when at the time, 20-knot storm turned into a 70-knot storm that had waves that crested almost 35 feet. The Nadine took on the storm quite well, holding its own for a few hours until the storm slowly started to chip away at the yacht. Among the first items to be lost to the storm was the 30-foot tender. After being beaten by the waves, the lines towing the boat finally gave way and the $100,000 toy was gone. The Nadine was slowly creeping through the storm at 3 or 4 knots when a massive wave smashed the foredeck, breaking it apart like nothing, leaving a 3 by 4 foot hole open to be filled by the next wave and the waves after that. At that point, the Nadine was taking on water and being torn apart by the violent Mediterranean. About an hour after the foredeck had been destroyed, one of the 18-foot jet boats that had been strapped to the deck came loose and smashed through the dining room windows. The Nadine's bow was now nearly underwater, and water was rushing through the dining room into the middle of the yacht. Water made its way through the salon and into some of the staterooms. At that point, Mark Elliott knew the Nadine was severely crippled and used a satellite phone to contact the Italian Coast Guard. Mark then met with the passengers and crew, told them the situation, and slowly, one by one, they all went to their rooms to collect passports and anything of value that was small enough to fit into a bag. When the Italian Coast Guard got the call, they immediately sent out a rescue helicopter. They even sent out a large, slower, but dependable rescue boat with other larger ships on standby. 30 minutes after Mark made the call, the rescue helicopter showed up to attempt to airlift passengers out. The helicopter lowered down a rescue diver, but between the dark, the violent storm, and the rolling waves, the diver wasn't able to make contact. The diver himself actually was almost lost after crashing into the crane and other parts of the yacht. He was eventually lifted back up, and the helicopter was forced to take off. Several hours had passed, and no one had been rescued yet. The storm got even worse, and anything that was on the deck of the Nadine was now lost. The larger ships that were on standby were also having troubles of their own trying to launch a rescue ship to head to the Nadine. Also, at one point in the night, a merchant ship that was nearby came to try to help the Nadine, but almost accidentally ran into it, coming as close as 15 feet from the yacht. Mark was able to maneuver the Nadine out of the way and avoided further disaster. There were several attempts throughout the night to send helicopters to rescue, but they all had the same issues as the first one. High seas, high winds, and low visibility made it almost impossible to get to it. The Nadine was sinking more and more into the water, and at this point, some crew members were sent to retrieve the life rafts to get ready to be used. But before they could get to one of the 3 life rafts, one of the trigger lines to a raft had gone off, inflating the raft and sending it over the side. A strong gust of wind had come in and tore the life raft away from the yacht, and it was never seen again. Now around 3 a.m., the commander of the Coast Guard made contact with Mark and put together a plan. They decided that they needed to clear away the helipad in order for a rescue to be possible, which meant that the helicopter that was strapped to the helipad would need to be lost. Mark was reluctant to do so, but him and the crew made efforts to release the straps that held the helicopter to the pad, and then he steered the Nadine in a direction that would allow the storm to sweep the helicopter off. The storm eventually swept the helicopter off the pad, and the helicopter was lost at sea. Now around 5 a.m., the rescue helicopters from the Coast Guard were sent back out, and the rescue was finally able to take place. All the people on the Nadine went in separate groups, starting with the female passengers, then the female crew, then the male guest, and lastly, some of the male crew members. Mark and a couple of crew members stayed on board the Nadine, still optimistic that they could save her. Mark and the remaining crew members loaded into the life raft, grabbed all the passports, some logs, and some of the personal belongings of the passengers, as they were not allowed to take them with them when the Coast Guard picked them up. Mark's last official act of duty aboard the Nadine, and at the request of the Coast Guard, was to go into the engine room and shut everything down. He did so, boarded the lifeboat, and was able to get out and away with the remaining crew members. 10 minutes after they were all cleared of the Nadine, she was gone. Mark was congratulated for what he was able to do with the Nadine and getting every single person off of the ship alive and uninjured. He was even offered command of Bernie Little's next large charter yacht. Mark has always kept his feelings about the sinking of the Nadine a secret, but noted that his biggest regret was leaving behind his banjo. The insurance was quick to pay out for the loss of the Nadine, considering the size and severity of the storm. The only thing that remained from the Nadine that was recovered without a scratch was the 30-foot tender that broke free early on. Now the Nadine rests 1,000 meters below the surface of the Mediterranean Sea, just 20 miles east of the coast of Sardinia. She was in operation for 35 years, saw numerous owners, transformations, and was likely host to some wild stories. From the Matilda to the Coco Chanel to Jan Pamela to Edgewater to Big Eagle and finally the Nadine, she lived a wild life. I just hope all the new owners followed the rules of renaming a boat, which I'll cover in another video. This was the Nadine. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. If you know of a unique shipwreck that you'd like me to cover, let me know. Thanks.